Alright guys, so here's what we're going to do today. We're going to talk about absolute value inequalities. If you have any questions over anything so far, again, I know I've said this a million times, but make sure you reach out to Miss Sanders or myself, and we'll be more than happy to help you or set up. By the end of this, we should be able to solve absolute value equations and inequalities. And the first thing I want to talk about is absolute value. What does that mean? All right, so absolute value to me means the distance between 2 points. All right, most of the time we talk about the distance between 0. And when we talk about distance, when we say distance, remember distance is always positive. Because you're not going to say, hey, how far is it from the school to my house? You're going to say, oh, it's a negative 1,000 yards. No, you're going to say it's 1,000 yards, right? So distance means positive always, and absolute value is a branch off of that. So if I gave you a number line, and I said, what's the absolute value of 5? So we start at 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. How far is it from 0 to 5? Well, most people will say it's 5 units, so your answer is 5. All right, now, if we go the other direction, what's the absolute value of negative 5? Well, how far is it from negative 5 to 0? Well, if I count, it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units. So absolute value means distance. That's always positive. And this one is from 0. However, I told you to find the absolute value between 2 points. So if I said find the absolute value between negative 2 and 5. All right? Or find the distance between negative 2 and 5. There's a couple different ways to go about it. So I could say negative 2 minus 5, the left number minus the right number. That's the absolute value of negative 7, which is 7, right? Or you can think about it like this. How far is it from negative 2 to 0? Well, that's 2 units. How far is it from 0 to 5? Well, that's 5 units. What's 2 plus 5? That is 7. So the distance between those 2 points would be 7 units, aka the absolute value of 7. All right, so that's just a little remembering of the definition of absolute value and what it means. Now, if we talk about a problem, it says, what is the value of x in 7 equals absolute value of x plus 2? Well, when you're solving absolute value inequalities, there's some steps you want to follow. All right, so if it's an equation like this, an equal sign, so we're talking about an equation with an equal sign, you want to isolate the absolute value. Then you want to ask yourself, is the number on the other side negative? And you want to solve the equation 2 ways. And I'll show you what I mean by all those. So the first step is to isolate the absolute value. So what that means is I want to get this absolute value of x by itself on one side of the equal sign. It can be the left or the right side. In this case, it's on the right side, so I'm just going to leave it there. So in order to isolate it, I need to subtract 2 from both sides. So I'm going to get 5 equals the absolute value of x. So now what you do is you say, is the number on the other side of the absolute value, on the other side of the equal sign, is it negative? Well, is 5 negative? No, it's positive, so then I continue. That means I can keep solving. Right? So now, when I say solve it in 2 ways, what you do is you set up 2 equations. You set up one like the original one, x equals 5, or you set one up like x equals negative 5. So what I did is I kept my absolute value the same, which was x in this case, whatever's inside of there, and I set it equal to 5 like the original problem. And on the next one, It's still what's inside the absolute value. Set it equal to. You change the sign now with the stuff on the other side, so it's -5. All right? So that would be my two answers. So go ahead and try that for the next problem. I want you guys to try this one. If you need to pause the video here, you can. Hopefully you've had time to solve it. So here's what you're going to do. You're going to add 2 to both sides. I want to isolate the absolute value. So I get 8 equals the absolute value of x. And I want to see, is the other side positive? The answer is yes. All right. If it's not positive, that means you're not going to have an answer, right? Because can I have an absolute value equal a negative number? No. Okay, so I'm going to solve it. I'm going to say the absolute value of x equals 8. Or the absolute value of x equals -8. And then really I kind of want to get rid of those absolute value signs because we're just worried about what's inside the absolute value. Normally you would solve it if you had to, but in this case you don't. So those are your two answers. Okay, so if you go to the next one, this one's a little bit harder. Think about absolute value like parentheses. I'll give you a little hint there. Think about absolute value like parentheses. So if I want to isolate the absolute value, what operation are you doing right here? Well, that would be multiplication. So your first step to isolate the absolute value would be to divide by 2. Your next step is to set up your two equations. So the absolute value stuff stays the same. So I still have x plus 5 equals, this time it's going to be a -2. And you would solve both equations. So I'm going to subtract 5. So x can be -3 or x can be -7. And that would be your two answers. So then we dive into the inequality side of it. All right, so the big thing to remember on inequalities is if you have greater than or equal to, that's an or statement. So after you isolate the absolute value, you're looking at the sign. If you have less than or equal to, that's called a and statement. All right, and this is kind of tying into the other compound inequalities that we've talked about before. So this first one, I have the absolute value of x is greater than 5. So step 1 is to isolate absolute value. And what I mean by that is you want it by itself on one side of the inequality sign. In this case, it's already by itself on the left side, so step 1's done for us. Step 2, you want to look at inequality sign to determine and or statement. Then your last step would be to write your two equations, solve. So I isolate the absolute value, which I already did. Now I'm going to look at my inequality sign. Since it's greater than, I know it's going to be a or statement. So now you have to write another equation. When you write another equation, you're going to take the absolute value of x. I'm going to flip my inequality sign. So what I mean is now I'm going to make it less than. And I'm going to change this to a -5. All right, so my two answers are x is greater than 5 or x is less than -5. And you should be able to graph this, just as a reminder. If it's less than or greater than, that's going to be an open circle. So I want less than -5 and greater than 5. And if it's usually an or statement, guys, there's going to be a gap in the middle. right? So look at this little gap that I have here. That would be my OR statement. The next one, x, absolute value of x is less than or equal to 5. All right, so I isolate the absolute value. That's my first step. It's already isolated. Now I look at the inequality sign to determine its and or statement. In this case, it's going to be a and statement. So now I'm going to say x is less than or equal to 5 and x is greater than or equal to, because you flip the inequality sign and you change the sign on the stuff that's not with the absolute value, or not inside the absolute value. All right, so on this one, if I were to graph this, because this would be my answer, because you normally you'd have to solve it, but there's nothing to solve there. So 5, -5, I'm going to use a closed circle. Now, less than or equal to 5 and greater than or equal to -5 means I shade in the middle. So normally on an and statement, you are going to shade in the middle. Not all the time, but normally. All right? So I want you to look at these next two that I just labeled 1 and 2 and kind of think about what you have to do here. So I have absolute value of x plus 3 is greater than 5. First step is to isolate the absolute value. Is the absolute value by itself on one side of the equation? Well, yes. The absolute value of x plus 3 is by itself on the left-hand side. So now you're going to look at the inequality sign. I notice it's greater than, so that means it's going to be a or statement. And I go ahead and write my second equation. Flip the inequality sign, change this to a -5. Notice nothing inside the absolute value changed. So I'm going to write them normal without the absolute value to solve them. Right? I would subtract 3 from both sides. And I get my two answers. X is greater than 2 or x is less than -8. Again, if you were going to graph it, -8, 2, I would use an open circle because of the inequality sign. And normally on an or statement, I shade in opposite directions. All right. The last one is 2x minus 1 greater than 5. So if I follow my steps again, I isolate the absolute value. That means it's by itself. It is on one side of the inequality sign. And then I look at the inequality sign to determine an and or statement. Greater than is going to be a or statement. So then I'm going to rewrite the equation with the absolute value staying the same, flip the inequality sign, and change the sign of the 5. So then I would add 1. So x is greater than 3 or x is less than -2. Now, here's the thing. If you're unsure on shading, right, I can use a test point, 4. So let's plug in 4 for my x. Instead of saying x, we're going to say 4. Is 4 greater than 3? Yes, it is. So I know it's true, so I shaded the correct way because you want it to be shaded over that number. Same way with -3. I can plug that into this inequality. Is -3 less than -2? Well, yeah, it is. So that means I need to shade over -3, which means I shaded in the correct direction. All right, now I'm going to challenge you guys a little bit. What if I gave you something like this? Okay, sounds a little bit harder. So don't forget, what operation are we doing right here? And I want you to pause the video and try this. All right, if you tried it, I really appreciate it. I'm going to work through it now. The first thing should have been divide both sides by -2. But here's the thing. When you divide by -2 to get the absolute value by itself, because you're isolating the absolute value, you have to flip the inequality sign. Whenever you multiply or divide by negative, you flip the inequality sign. So now this is what my problem looks like. So now that the absolute value is by itself, I need to decide, is it an and or an or statement? Well, in this case, it's an and statement. Whereas before, it would have been an or statement, but whenever I flip it, it changes the problem. So now I'm going to subtract my 3. I get x is less than 0, and x is greater than negative 6. So when I graph it, I would use open circles, and it's an and statement, so I'm more than likely going to shade in between. Again, that's just a nice challenge problem to look at. All right. The last thing I want you guys to do is I want you to try these 3 problems right here. So on your own, I'm going to pause the video, go ahead and try it. I will work them out, but it is nice to see if you remember how to do this. So equal sign is different from an inequality sign. So the first one, you should have subtracted 3 to get the absolute value by itself. And then you're going to set up your 2 equations. So it's either going to be 2 or negative 2. Next one's a little bit harder. The absolute value is by itself. However, you have to set up your 2 equations. I just changed the sign of stuff that's not inside the absolute value. So on both these, I'm going to add 8. I'm going to divide by 2 on both of them. So I get my 2 answers. So hopefully you did really, really well on 5 and 6. Now number 7 is a little bit harder. We got to think about our rules. Isolate the absolute value. Well, it looks like it's by itself on one side of the equation. And I'm going to look at the inequality sign. So in this one, the inequality sign greater than or equal to means it's a or statement. So then I'm going to write my 2 equations. I'm going to add 6 on both of them to solve them. I'm going to divide by 3. And I get my 2 answers. So it's greater than or equal to 5, less than or equal to negative 1. And I would shade to the outside. And that's it for today. If you guys have any questions, make sure you're contacting myself or Miss Sanders. We are more than happy to help. Enjoy your day, guys.